The morning cut into the house like a careful blade, soft light through high windows, porcelain quiet in rooms that could buy entire neighborhoods. Helena had been sweeping since before dawn, the rhythm of the brooms stitched into her hands. She knew the castle by touch, the way dust gathered in corners of carved feet of tables, which curtains caught the sun first, which doors squeaked when opened the wrong way. She did not own much, but she knew how other people's things breathed. The nursery door was closed when she arrived. It had been that way since the housekeeper finished her rounds. Helena kept a small respect for closed doors in a place of such precise order. But fate does not always respect protocol. The latch gave with a breath of sound, and the room inside was almost theatrical. White walls, mobile suspended like a halo, a crib that looked as if it had been arranged by someone who measured tenderness the way they measured linen. Every corner was in its place. Then she saw the child, not in the crib as the house's tidy choreography promised, but on the tile floor. The little body lay curled near the baseboard, a knotted blanket used as a pillow. A tiny hand peeked from under the cheek. It could have been a picture from another life. The sight split the morning in two. Helena's first instinct was not to ask questions. She moved. Her fingers, those hands seasoned by years of washing, folding, and mending, closed under the child's back like a cupped reed. The skin was cool, too cool for a body that had spent the night. There was an immediate small arithmetic in her head: floor, cold, and a crib made for softness. She did not make a sound. She lifted the baby, careful of the neck she had never supported before, felt the slight tremor under the ribs, the tiny inhalations almost inaudible. The child smelled faintly of floral detergent and something like the outside of soap bars, nothing of milk, of the warmth of another chest. Helena tucked the blanket more securely and headed toward the tiny door that led to her own quarters, 2 rooms at the back of the house, modest, honest. A mattress lay on the floor there, a thin thing with a patch she had sewn last winter. It would be enough. On the mattress, she set the baby down. The cool seemed to peel away from the girl as quickly as the light in the nursery, replaced by a small, private warmth. The baby's eyes, so recently slack with sleep, fluttered open. The air in the small room changed, less like a clean show, more like a place that had kept secrets. The baby's breathing slowed. She curled and immediately, as if by some animal calculus, relaxed. A minute later she was quiet again, the steady sigh of sleep returning. Helena sat on the edge of the mattress and watched the rise and fall of a chest so small it belonged to a different calendar. She smoothed the blanket. Her fingers associated warmth with skin in a way they had not in years.
There were things she knew how to do without thinking. A boiled egg for a feeble stomach, a boiled shirt for stains that would not come out, how to coax a cough into being less of a freight. But there was something this morning that had to be learned as she went, how to guard without making the child more visible than danger. She could have taken the baby directly to the front desk and called for the nanny. The rules were clear, the house ran on them. But Helena had watched discipline and affection arrive in separate parcels inside that house, and occasionally suspected the two had never met. Protocol could be precise and cruel. So she stayed small and quiet, making a nest out of what little she had, listening to the house breathe around them. The child slept as if she trusted the mattress, immediate, absolute trust. Helena thought of the floor again and what it told her. Someone had chosen the cold tile over the padded sleep of the crib. It was not an accident. Her mind moved through the possibilities as a slow, seasoned clock. She had seen neglect, not the kind that meant bruises and cries, but the kind that hid behind a clean sheet and a rigid schedule. There are ways people teach distance. Helena had learned to read them. She had not been in the room long when she heard the soft click of the nursery door down the hall. Footsteps, the house's clockwork returning to life. The nanny, Barbara, was precise in her timing. She liked things to proceed as her plan laid them out. Helena did not go back to the nursery to explain. She folded the blanket more carefully, smoothing the tiny sleeve, and sat there, hands in her lap, while behind the wall the house resumed its polished choreography. If you like human stories that reveal truth through small moments, subscribe. Helena's life beyond the walls of that house was a ledger of small numbers. A niece who lived 2 hours away, and a mother who preferred the radio to company. The mattress on which Helena had placed the child that morning was not a symbol she planned, as much as it was a tool of necessity, an act that made sense in a way bigger things need not. The girl who slept there could have been anyone's, and in another life might have had parents who stayed until the night dissolved. Here she had a crib that had the right brand, the exact threads,
and no one there to keep someone small warm. A week is long when it is the kind of week that makes you careful. Helena told herself she would watch. She learned to be invisible in the spaces where other people thought themselves most seen. She listened for the small rustles that betrayed truth, where the nursery sheets gave with use, if the mattress bore the imprint of a child's hair on a pillow that meant someone had lain there within the night. She noted the absence of these marks. The crib was an unreachable island, immaculate as if it had never cradled the child at all. Barbara's uniform was always precise.
There was no wrinkle in the way she folded the child's shirts, no smudge on her hands that the house's lights could catch. She had a way of speaking about teaching that turned soft things into subject matter. "We must not spoil her," she said once, not to Helena, but to another staff member, as though the policy was not an opinion, but a doctrine. The woman tended to deliver care like an experiment, controlled variables, predictable outcomes. Helena had seen efficient people before. They can be brilliant at saving a day from collapse, but often at the cost of warmth. Helena watched small scenes stack against that doctrine. Once she cradled the child while wiping the counter in the kitchenette, and the girl turned her face into Helena's shoulder, fingers finding the seam of a shirt. The baby sighed into the scent of soap and the faint tang of boiled onions, domestic smells. When Barbara came by to take the child for a scheduled feed, the baby stiffened the fraction of an inch that made everything visible. A hand tightened, a tremor in the jaw. The nanny took the child without looking at Helena. Her movements were efficient, clean, and in leaving the room she left an absence like a shutter closing. Helena had no desire to be heroic. She had a fear that waited her at the collar, loss of work, the family in the other town who depended on her small checks. There were also habits of loyalty bred in her by decades of serving. But the sight on the floor did not leave her. It stuck like a burr you could not shake. She began to arrange evidence in a quiet ledger of the mind. She spoke to Rosa, the housekeeper assigned to the West Wing, who had been sweeping the grand staircase when Helena first found the child. Rosa's voice, when it came, was soft and lined with the same wear as Helena's hands. "I saw the bed last night," Rosa said. "So perfect. It looked like the bed in a magazine." Rosa's eyes slid away. "But I didn't hear her all night. Not once." "It was like someone staged it," Helena said. "Yes," Rosa agreed. "Like something you put on a table you want a guest to see." Those small confessions did not sound like accusations in the way that newspapers make them. They were murmured facts. A bed made too perfectly for someone who had slept there. Silence where there should have been stirring. The staff were not brave as characters in plays. They were human beings with families and wants. Some said nothing because their silence kept them whole. Others whispered because not saying anything felt like letting a shape grow in the dark. Helena began to afford herself a ritual of watching. It was careful, almost like a prayer without words. She observed the child's clothing for the faint ring of detergent, the way the hair lay flat as if not smoothed recently, the lack of milk scent that ordinarily lingered. She looked at the floor surrounding the crib. There were no circles of dirt where a child had rolled in the night.
The mat near the crib, where people might set a baby or a bag overnight, was also pristine. It would have been easy for someone who wanted to hide something to stage a crib for visitors and let the child sleep somewhere else entirely. But why? Helena asked herself. Why risk the child's body to a cold tile? The house had been home to the billionaire for a decade. His name meant something in their town, and something larger in the world of finance. Antonio Vasconcelos, people said the name in the staff room like saying a temperature, was not present as a father was in storybooks. He was present as a ledger, a voice on the phone, occasional long, laconic returns that filled rooms for a day or two before the jet engines of his life took him away again. He was generous in money and precise in expectations, a man who left the shape of his approval in how things were arranged. He came back one afternoon with luggage in his wake and the subtle smell of another city's winter clinging to his coat. The house lit up in the way servants do when the owner returns. There was a bustle that made the marble breathe. Helena kept her cleaning calm. She kept out of sight like a shadow that does not cast. But Antonio had an eye honed by years of being surrounded by things that attempted to hide their truth. He was, by training and temperament, attentive to the wrong kind of perfection. He paused at the nursery door, as if he had been called by the line of a melody. Women straightened and the staff shuffled as if in a covert dance. The house felt like a theater set rearranging itself to face its lead actor. When he stepped in, the crib looked as it always had been in public, immaculate, no bow misplaced. He did not go in a theatrical way. He walked with a quiet that indicated he was searching for more than objects. His hand found the crib rail and lingered, not in ownership, but in inventory. He pressed lightly on the mattress as though testing for a print, an impression someone had left in the night. Helena watched from the hall, hidden behind the angle of an open door, and saw him notice a seam of difference. The mattress had no indentation. Antonio's eyes narrowed just a fraction. He glanced around the nursery with the practiced look of someone who had seen rooms arrange lives in ways that sometimes didn't add up. He did not call for Barbara immediately. Instead, he walked slowly back into the hallway, and then toward the back wing where Helena had her quarters. The staff in the passage stepped aside, and the house hummed with the low current of waiting. When Antonio reached the doorway of the small room where Helena had put the child, he stopped. The little mattress on the floor was visible beyond the threshold, a modestness that seemed to draw his attention not by the room's size but by its matter-of-fact presence. He saw the child asleep, cheek against the handmade patch in the blanket, hair tousled.
For a man accustomed to money controlling scenes, the sight of the child asleep on a mattress made of necessity seemed to land in him like a question. He lingered at the door, as if he were reading the room, not for articles of value, but for what presence might mean. He watched the rise and fall of the small chest in her sleep. He watched Helena, who sat on the edge of the bed, hands flat against her knees. There was no drama, no raised voice. What unfolded between them was of another order, soft, small, and potent. He stepped a hair into the room, and then retreated without speaking. Those around him did not move. They were uncertain whether his pause was a pause for thought or something else. Antonio's world spoke to him in loyalties and in quiet inconsistencies. The immaculate crib had left him with a cognitive gap. Something too perfect can be the cover for something real and inconvenient. He made his way back down the corridor, not openly accusing, but with the slow, methodical thought of a man who had to reconcile an image with a fact. Helena felt the shadow of his gaze as a small pressure along the shoulders. She had always known men of his sort by the way they could make entire rooms smaller simply by entering them. She kept her face composed, as if the house's polished calm was simply another assignment. Inside, her chest was a drum. She had protected the child for a morning and a few afternoons. She had whispered small confidences to the infant in a language of hands. Now the house's owner had seen something, and in seeing, altered the map of possibilities. In the kitchen, Barbara continued her routine. She arranged food with mathematical calm, set the child's bottles in a line like a row of little sentries. When staff spoke of her, they used the word method. "She is no nonsense," one of the gardeners said once. "She does not indulge, she believes in rules." The rules had been sold to the house as discipline, as a way of raising a child who would not be indulgent in the face of riches. People outside might call it tough love. Inside the house, it sometimes resembled a distance with measurements. After Antonio's return, small things shifted. He walked the house with an attentive eye, pausing in rooms that had been arranged for public inspection, and sometimes opening doors that servants had been told to keep closed. He asked no loud questions. He clipped a quiet line into conversations that made them rearrange themselves. "How has she been sleeping?" he asked once, casually, as if discussing the gardener's new seeds. He received the answer he expected. "All is scheduled," Barbara said, precise and unruffled. Helena heard the exchange from the pantry doorway where she wiped the rims of glasses. The tone in Barbara's voice was like a measured recipe, no residue of care beyond efficacy. Helena did not volunteer the morning's discovery. She felt the weight of the choice, heavy and personal. She had, in another life, been a mother of a girl who had married and left, and that memory uncoiled inside her like a thread. It made her protective in ways that mixed tenderness and fear. She feared speaking because she feared the consequences. The man who paid her would not like trouble in the household. But she feared more the idea that a child could be taught alone to contain discomfort as a virtue. There were nights when Helena would lie awake on her mattress and imagine the crib as a stage. It was a place a family might show to the world to attest to their care. If someone wanted to hide something, putting a child on the floor when guests were not near would not be the most expensive crime. It was a minor cruelty with no outward scars. It required only the absence of warmth. She watched for the child's small habits, a thumb finding her mouth, a gasp in sleep, the soft exhale that means safety. When the baby was with Helena, the thumb curled and relaxed. When Barbara lifted her, the thumb hardened. Chance brought Helena a moment where an observation outfitted itself as evidence. One afternoon, a visiting friend of Antonio's, a man from the world of investments with a foreign laugh, was given the tour. The show passed before him. The polished glass, a display of children's clothes that looked like art, the reclining chair that filled a corner like a sculpture. They paused by the nursery door. Barbara adjusted the mobile so the visitor would see the scene she wanted to present. The baby's crib was presented like a claim that everything was in its right place. Helena watched from the hall as the man leaned into the room and frowned, not with criticism but with a practical mind that noticed the absence of a trace. He lifted the blanket and ran a finger along the mattress as if checking proof. "No impression," he said quietly. That phrase lodged in the house like a pebble in a shoe. The man did not go further. He had no responsibility to pry into a family's private life. But he had been trained to spot anomalies. No indent in a mattress where a child had slept. He exchanged a look with Antonio later in the day, a small acknowledgement that some things in that house were composed to be seen rather than felt. The staff began to speak in new, careful phrases. "She looks peaceful when Miss Helena holds her," Rosa said once, and the line was not praise so much as observation. Helena was not oblivious to the political economy of gratitude. A word could become a currency you paid with to keep your job. The staff lived with these small transactions in ways that hardened their edges into quiet refusals or whispered confidences. Gossip in such a house behaves like light through blinds. It makes bands across floors, and the things it touches look striped and partial. Word made its way to small ears, across the kitchen, into the garden, through the laundry room, a child sleeping on the floor. The story grew a coat of small explanations.
"She is teaching the child to be independent," one staff member said. "The nanny believes in firm hands." Other staff shrugged and moved on because the house demanded adaptation, and the bills of the people who worked there would not wait for moral clarity. Yet the repeated small things began to build a structure on which suspicion could stand. Helplessness in a child does not need drama to be real. It needs only absence, which is quieter than any shout. Helena had not shouted. She had cradled and watched and kept her mouth closed. But as she assembled softer evidence, a child's hair unmussed, a pillow that did not curve with a cheek, a crib that belonged to the world of displays, she felt the inner maps of rightness and wrongness shift. She knew what she had to do with the facts that pressed on her. At the same time, Antonio moved with both leisure and precision. He was not interested in spectacle. He had friends who made spectacle their trade. Instead, he cultivated ripples. He asked questions that sounded like the weather, and through that casualness he caught details. When he noticed the mattress on the floor, he asked in a tone neither accusatory nor affectionate, "Who sleeps on that?" "It is Miss Helena's bed," someone answered. The answer was factual, not explanatory. "And the child?" Antonio asked. He did not demand theatrics. He wanted the shape of things. "It seemed to fall to Miss Helena to put her there in the mornings," Rosa whispered. Antonio did not show surprise. He folded the information into his calm, like someone arranging papers into a folder. He did not storm or shout. That was his power, stillness, not violence. He had always been a man for quiet remediations. He learned through seeing. The crib's perfect sheet had already lodged in his head as a kind of evidence of performance, but seeing the child asleep on a floor mattress in the hands of a woman who watched her as if guarding something changed his internal ledger. He spent the next day watching small things. He made light comments, asked about the child's night, let the conversation be open but not loud. He noticed the nanny's answer, precise, like a clock. "She sleeps in the crib during the night," Barbara said to him. The voice carried no tremor, but Antonio's gaze, relaxed as it was, could catalog evasions and omissions. He noted the lack of an indent in the crib and the absence of the child's scent on the crib's linens. He made a small mental tally that did not read as accusation, but as a puzzle to be pieced together. For Helena, the knowledge that eyes higher in the house were beginning to look at the wrong kinds of perfection felt like both a relief and a danger. Relief because the house's owner had the power to adjust things. Danger because being noticed meant that the shelter she had made for the child could be questioned and measured in ways that would expose her. She had watched too many times how those above could construe well-meant acts as overstepping.
The politics of kindness are often more complicated than the politics of discipline. Late that afternoon, while tidying in a room overlooking the garden, Helena saw Antonio stand by the nursery door and glance at the room as if reading a page. He then walked down the corridor with that slow, purposeful step she had observed before.
He did not call for Barbara as he passed. He did not raise his voice. He seemed to be moving toward a decision that would require measured words, not a storm. Helena's hands paused on a stack of linens. The mattress where the child slept was visible from a high window when she returned to her quarters. The baby shifted, fingers curling, and in that small gesture Helena felt the weight of all unspoken things. She straightened the blanket and realized with a quick, honest fear that the house's balance might soon tilt. There were no scripts for what might happen next. There were only choices waiting for a man who had made a life of choices. As the evening settled, so did a hush that felt different from the house's practiced calm. It was as if someone had taken the tone down a notch and asked the night to keep its counsel. The child slept through the shifting shadows, and Helena sat near the mattress, hands folded, thinking of the small ways people can be tender and the small ways they can mistake discipline for care. She was neither a judge nor a hero, only a woman who brushed dust from shelves and who had, in a morning, chosen a child's warmth over a rule. Antonio, meanwhile, walked the rooms and noticed things that did not fit the pictures he had seen in glossy magazines. He smelled the faint suggestion of detergent where there should have been the imprint of a body. He put lines together the way someone arranges chess pieces, patiently and with a mind for the endgame. There was no drama in his movements. The drama was in the potential consequences of a small truth being told aloud. When he finally paused by the little room again, the child had slumbered into a sleep that looked generous and trusting. Helena's silhouette at the edge of the mattress was unobtrusive. He did not stride in like a man claiming wrongdoing. He studied the scene quietly, as if absorbing its geometry. His hands steepled with hovering. There was a thoughtfulness in his presence that could be as generous as it could be deceptive. He left without a loud pronouncement. The house closed around his quiet. For the first time since her discovery, Helena felt the story of the floor become larger than the morning it had begun in. She had been a small guardian in a place that did not always celebrate guardianship. Now the house's master had noticed a wrong kind of perfection. The question hung between what this would mean for everyone in the house, for the child, and for Helena herself. The next day promised answers of a kind. Helena did not sleep much.
She arranged the child's clothes in a small drawer, as if making an inventory of the things she loved. She washed a tiny sock and pinned it on the line to dry, an act of care that made the house smell of citrus and soap. The little routine anchored her. She knew she had done the right thing when she moved the child to her mattress, but she also understood the fragility of rightness in a house where power breathed through rooms like an unstruck bell. When the morning came, she was awake before the lights. The child stirred and opened her eyes. Helena met them and felt the soft magnetism of trust. Outside, somewhere down the lane where the gates opened, a car pulled in and the low thrum of a changed day began to unfold. Helena smoothed the child's blanket and thought of the ways truth reveals itself in small things: an untouched crib, a pillow with no dent, a sleeping child who breathes differently in different arms. She did not know how Antonio would act, but she understood that the map of their house had been redrawn. The discovery had tilted the axis of a life. And yet, in the kitchen below, Barbara moved as before, arranging the day in quick, sure motions. She was unaware that the largest of the house's secrets had begun to unspool through very small stitches. She taught discipline the way others taught recipes, rules to be followed, ingredients to be measured. If there was cruelty in it, it wore a cape of conviction, not malice. That made it harder to dismantle. Helena watched both women move within the house like ships in a small harbor. She had no desire to be a captain. She only wished to keep the child safe. She kept the secret of the mattress for now, because sometimes secrecy is a shield. But secrets have weight, and weight invites gravity. By midday, Antonio had called for a small meeting, a conversation that would be small but not private. Staff filed into a sitting room with the etiquette of people who had spent their lives learning how to occupy spaces without making ripples. He spoke without flourish. "I want to know how our child is sleeping," he said, and the sound of that sentence was neither harsh nor indulgent. It was an invitation to truth. Barbara replied with the polish of her certainty. "She follows the schedule. She sleeps in the nursery at night, sir. We keep her routines." Antonio nodded slowly, and when he did, it became clear his interest went beyond schedules. He seemed to be listening not to defend anyone, but to chart facts. People in a house like that learned quickly that words delivered without the burden of emotion can be more revealing than the loudest accusation. Antonio had, in his life, learned to prefer the quiet turning of pages to the thunder that spoiled arguments. Helena sat in the back of the room, palms flat on her knees. Her heart beat a steady measure. She could keep silent and hope the balance favored the child's warmth. Or she could speak and risk everything she had.
The child slept in the mattress down the hall, trusting a woman who had no right to give her that much comfort. It seemed a small thing, but small things make up the world. The meeting ended with small promises and the kind of reassurances that placate and postpone. Yet Antonio's face held a set line when he glanced at the nursery. A man like him did not need drama to effect change. He had the capacity to recalibrate a household without public humiliation. He had the capacity to make subtle corrections that reorganize loyalties and expectations. In that moment, Helena understood the precariousness of her position. She had protected a child with the simplest of tools: her own body, a borrowed blanket, a mattress sewn with love. The house's owner had begun to notice. The story that had started on a cold floor was moving toward a place where choices would be made. Those choices could clear the air or make it heavier. Helena did not sleep that night. She sat by the mattress and sang a song she had learned from her mother, a small lullaby made of odd syllables and the names of flowers. The child slept through it, breathing in the rhythm of a voice that did not belong to the house's curated music. Outside, the city continued on its indifferent pulse. Inside, small decisions unfolded like gears in a machine that only she had noticed had been misaligned. When dawn edged the curtains the next morning, Helena straightened the blanket and held the child close for a last-minute private understanding. The house shifted around them. Someone somewhere clicked on a light. Antonio's footsteps were already moving in the corridor, an even tread that told of private thought. He would, in a few moments, speak to someone. He would ask a question that required less heat than it would honesty. Helena held her breath for what would come. She had no illusions about how power moves. She had, however, faith, simple and quiet, in the smallness of care. She had learned long ago that greatness sometimes slept on the floor in the form of acts no one else saw. She had placed the child on a mattress, and in doing so had tilted the world just enough to allow a truth to surface. The door downstairs opened. Antonio's voice carried, calm and reserved. He asked for Barbara. The house breathed in that sound. The old pattern of neatness would soon be measured against another pattern: the warmth of the body, the ease of a breath in somebody's arms. Helena smoothed the blanket one more time and listened as the house prepared to name what it had seen. Antonio closed the study door with the same soft authority he used to close deals, quietly, with the sense that walls could be trusted to keep what was said inside. Barbara stood with that posture she kept for inspections, shoulders squared, hands folded as if holding the outline of a plan. There was a precision in her face that had always made the staff take her seriously. She had been the household's measure of order for months.
He did not begin with condemnation. He sat across from her, palms folded on the desk between them, and spoke as if naming a weather pattern might be more useful than striking a match. "Tell me about the child's nights," he asked, voice even and low. "How is she put to sleep? Who is with her?" Barbara answered with the architecture of certainty. "We follow a schedule. Bath, feed, lullaby at 9. She is put in the crib and sleeps through the night. We do not indulge her waking. She learns to settle." Antonio's features barely altered. His attention narrowed in a way that made listeners feel measured rather than attacked. "And the crib," he asked, "does it show signs of being used overnight?" Barbara blinked, as if the question struck farther than she expected. "The crib is used at night, sir. I check it." Her voice carried the weight of habitual answers, formulas she had said and had them accepted. "We are careful, nothing out of place." "I observed something different," Antonio replied. "A mattress on the floor in the staff quarters. The child asleep on it, not in the crib. Why would that be so?" Barbara's expression tightened. For the first time she showed the friction of having to account for a choice, rather than reciting a rule. She offered a version that sounded rehearsed and defensive in equal measure. "Sometimes small sleepers are soothed in the staff wing when there are transitions. It is temporary. The child is comfortable there when the routine requires it." Antonio leaned back in his chair, listening for the small seams that betray a story. "Temporary," he repeated. "For how long? Who authorized that? And why the discrepancy between the immaculate crib and a child sleeping elsewhere?" Her answers wobbled. At moments she reverted to doctrine, independence, firm boundaries. At moments she offered tiny logistical explanations, an interrupted feed, a fitful night, none of which quite explained the tactile facts he had noticed. No indentation in the crib mattress, linens that lacked the faint warm scent of someone who had lain there, and the child's particular relaxation when resting in Helena's arms. In the quiet room, facts were like small beads he rolled across the desk with his fingers. "You understand," he said finally, "that my first concern is the child's welfare, not the house's arrangement." "It is the same thing," Barbara replied too quickly. "A child raised correctly will be well. My methods are..." "Measured,"
Antonio supplied, letting the finish of the sentence hang in the air. He did not use the word the staff had used in kitchens and gardens, no nonsense, as if it were praise. He let her words sit with him and watched how they stacked. There was a moment where the power of the house was visible in the way the silence lasted. Barbara, accustomed to being the unquestioned keeper of methods, discovering that the house's master was asking questions she could not simply deflect.
Antonio's decision did not rely on demonstrative fury. It relied on the authority to act and the capacity to make those acts private and precise. "Given what I have seen and what has been reported," he said, "I will relieve you of the role of principal nanny. You will be reassigned to an administrative position in the household. You will receive a severance and an offer for training if you wish." Barbara's face moved through a range of small colors: surprise, resentment, hurt. She blinked, voice clipped. "An administrative position?" "A role that does not involve direct care of the child," Antonio said. "We will restructure the child care team, and I expect full cooperation in the transition." She tried to argue nuance, methods, efficiency, children's resilience, but without the language that could simultaneously deny the child's experience and maintain her position. Antonio listened, his hands folded, and when she finished, he simply offered the practicalities: her reassignment, the terms, the expectation of discretion. There would be no spectacle, no scandal for the staff to scuttle through the gardens at whisper. The correction would be managerial, not theatrical. In the corners of the room, the staff who had been present felt the house turn on an axis they could not buy. For Helena, who had not been in the study, but had watched Antonio take his time with the facts, the choice to keep the child's safety had taken on a new light. The quiet correctness of action might be the greatest force in the house. She was still uncertain how much of her sheltering had been seen and how much would be measured by the ledger of consequence. She feared both recognition and retribution in equal parts. A private meeting followed, one that Antonio arranged with a care that felt personal rather than bureaucratic. He found Helena sitting where she often did, hands resting on her knees, eyes steady, as if watching for small things to go right. He closed the door softly and sat beside her on a chair that was too formal for the intimacy of what he intended to say. "You've kept something from me," he began, not as accusation, but as the simple fact of the world. "Not out of malice, I think, out of fear." Helena's fingers tightened on her skirt. She had rehearsed no speech, only the one made of instinct that had drawn her to the child that morning. "I didn't want to lose this job," she said, the truth small and simple. "I thought if I said anything, they would say I interfered." Antonio listened with the same quietness he had used with Barbara, but with a softer edge. "You could have been seen as overstepping," he acknowledged, "but what you did was not overstepping. You provided care that the child needed. That matters to me more than the neatness of linens." He reached into his desk and pulled out an envelope, not to deliver money like a reward, but to formalize a decision he had already made. "I want you to care for her," he said, "not as a secret, but openly." A permanent role as the child's primary in-house caregiver, with appropriate compensation, a consistent schedule, and a private room near hers. Helena's first reaction was disbelief. The offer felt like a tide carrying a boat she had not meant to leave. She imagined the risks, the jealousies, the staff talk, but also the possibility that her small acts could translate into long-term security for the child and for herself. "Why would you?" she began. "Because you saw what others did not," Antonio answered. "Because you acted before spectacle, and because I want the child to have people around her who choose her warmth over an image. I do not know everything that has been done, and I do not want to frame anyone as inherently bad, but I can change the environment. I want you to be a part of that change." He offered practicalities: a contract that would guarantee days off and fair wages, the possibility of a pension contribution, a modest private room that would no longer be a necessity but a choice for rest, a direct line to the household manager, so her concerns would be heard without passing through intermediaries. He spoke with an attention to detail that made Helena think of how he worked with his businesses, looking for efficiency that also preserved the human within. Helena did not accept immediately. She had lived with suspicion long enough to know that gratitude can be both an opening and a debt. She asked for time to think. Antonio insisted that she need not worry about immediate job security. "Take the week," he said, "but tell me if you have needs beyond what the contract offers. I want to make sure you and the child are safe."
Helena considered the offer and the consequences. To accept was to risk being visible, to step into a role that might be watched and critiqued. To refuse was to remain invisible and to risk the child's comfort being sidelined again. She thought of the mattress and the way the child's breathing had changed under her hand. The decision felt less like taking a job than like stepping into an authorization to continue what she had already begun. When she finally replied, her voice had steadiness. "I will stay," she said, "if you'll have me." Antonio nodded. "Then we will make the changes quietly and clearly. There will be training for the staff, we will review night routines, and I will be present more often than I have been." That last promise would be the hardest for a man whose life had been around flights, conferences, and meetings. He did not pretend it would be easy. He recognized that presence is a discipline, not a gesture. But he was sincere. His return home had revealed a gap between provision and presence that he had not attended to before. Barbara's reassignment did not become a scandal. There was a meeting of the household in which Antonio spoke with the same economy of motion he had used in private.
He told them he wanted the child's care recalibrated. He explained the new structure and the lines of responsibility. There was no vilification, no dramatic denunciation. He framed it as necessary for the child's well-being. Some staff interpreted the change as a rebuke for Barbara. Others read it as an opportunity. The household would now need more eyes attuned to comfort and warmth, not only to schedules. Rosa, among others, felt the shift as relief. She had watched small things grow in the corners of rooms and wished for the day when an unarranged crib might not be mistaken for efficiency. There were murmurs, of course. People arrange meaning in houses where daily survival depends on not making waves. But the household altered its rhythm slowly, like a clock whose pendulum has been nudged to swing in a kinder arc. Antonio's corrections went beyond personnel. He called for a review of the routines, feeding schedules, nap times, who had the authority to move the child. He insisted on transparency. A log of nighttime checks would be kept, and supervisory visits would be appointed. He did not want the house to be policed by secrecy, but to be guided by rules that privileged the child's comfort. "A rule without the human that makes it work is only a drawing on paper," he told the staff. "We must not confuse form with care." Helena's promotion changed her days in quiet ways that mattered. She was given regular time off, a day to visit her mother and niece without guilt. She received a modest increase in pay that meant a new pair of shoes for the winter and a small savings for emergencies. The private room near the nursery remained modest, but had been repaired and painted with colors Helena had chosen. A blue not too bright, a curtain that caught the afternoon sun just so. It was not a gift that erased her past, but it honored the role she had taken up, a named, visible guardian. For the child, Leah, as Antonio had chosen to call her when the adoption papers had been signed, life shifted in subtler ways. The mattress in Helena's room remained, not as an emergency bed, but as a place for afternoon naps. Helena would sometimes bring Leah there in the late afternoon, after the house had quieted, and read her murmured stories. The child learned the shapes of hands that had been steady, and the warm smell of boiled shirts and lemons. Under Helena, Leah's sleep took on a trust that appeared in small gestures, a thumb that found her mouth easily, eyelids closing without the tightness Helena had first noticed. Antonio found that being present was less dramatic than he had imagined. It began with small rituals. Once a week he read in the nursery for a half hour, voice low and careful as he tested the cadence of stories. He learned Leah's favorite sound, a soft rasp she made before she fell asleep, and in learning it, adjusted his own rhythm to hers.
Other times he would make tea with Rosa and listen to how the staff spoke, not to evaluate them, but to learn their truths. He instituted a small monthly meeting where staff could raise concerns directly to the household manager without fear of retribution. He did not pretend all tensions dissolved. Barbara, reassigned to the administrative wing, took her severance and some training offers. She left the direct care of children behind, which she resented, but the transition was handled with an attention not to shame, but to practicality. The staff adjusted. Some were relieved. Others felt the loss of a rigid authority that had for some been a source of clarity. The household, like any organism, adapted. In the weeks that followed, moments accumulated like pebbles on a riverbed, each small act making a new current. Leah began to exhibit a curiosity that was not a reactive guardedness, but a clear interest in the world at hand. She reached for Helena's hair, for Antonio's book, for the fringe of a throw. These were not grand gestures, no cinematic reunions, but they were real and private. Helena would watch Leah stretch in the morning light, a little body that had once slept on tile, now used to the cushion of a mattress and the softness of being held. Antonio noticed different things than before. He noticed the child's breath changing when he entered a room and relaxed when Helena sat nearby. One evening, he found himself staying longer after a meeting, an extra half-hour of reading, a silence that had become for him a kind of homework. He was learning to be patient, as a father learns the contours of another's life, through repetition, small failures, and quiet victories. The staff's culture shifted. Rosa began to take small, visible leadership in the West Wing, mentoring younger workers on how to notice without being intrusive. The garden crew learned to leave toys in designated places, and the kitchen matched the child's food to the nutritionist's new schedule. There were new policies on night checks, a written log, a rotating schedule for staff presence, a protocol that required at least 2 adults to be aware of where the child slept. The policies were not elaborate, they were practical and meant to prevent a single person's method from becoming the house's default. In the evenings, when the light through the high windows painted the rooms long and thin, Antonio sometimes sat by the nursery doorway and watched the scene as if measuring an investment. He had spent years measuring portfolios and markets. He now measured trust. He learned to recognize the difference between a bed that was staged and a bed that bore the invisible evidence of presence. This did not make him a saint. It made him more attentive. He began to rearrange his life in small increments, fewer dinners on the road, more canceled speeches, an extra hour at home when possible. He did not always succeed. He missed a reading now and then.
But the attempt itself altered the household's shape. There were small tests to the new order, as there are to most changes. Once, a visitor with a practiced eye and a tendency to talk fast arrived and remarked, half-jokingly, on the mattress in the corner of Helena's room. "Is that for ad hoc visits?" he asked, laughing. Helena glanced at Antonio, who had accompanied the guest, and then she answered with the modest truth. "It's where she naps sometimes," she said. "It's where she feels safe." The guest's laugh softened. He looked at Leah, who was busy with a wooden block, and then at the man whose money had once arranged a different kind of household. Antonio added, "It's part of how we keep her safe." Conversations like that taught the staff how to navigate a world where a private decision had become accepted practice. Some of the older staff grumbled at changes, as older people do. Others felt relief that an impulse to protect had been institutionalized rather than hidden. The house, if it had been a stage, now housed an audience learned in a new script. Months passed, and the child's trust deepened. Small scenes accrued, Leah slipping a hand into Helena's while a door closed, Antonio learning to knot a tiny scarf her grandmother had mailed, Rosa bringing half a lemon tart to the nursery because she knew Leah liked the sharpness of citrus, each an act that reordered the architecture of that home. One afternoon, Antonio stood in the nursery doorway, watching Leah sleep in her crib, her cheeks slightly flushed from play. The crib bore faint impressions now, linens warming with evidence that someone had lain there. He observed the trace of sleep on the mattress and thought of the morning when a tiny body had been on cold tile and when his eyes had been opened to a mismatch between form and care. He had not come to absolve himself. He had come to correct what had been missed. He walked quietly to Helena's room and found her at the edge of the mattress, smoothing a blanket over Leah as she settled into an afternoon nap. The mattress remained in the corner, patched and familiar, but the crib now owned the nights and the mattress the naps. The balance pleased him more than any arrangement of artful furniture ever could. "I wanted to thank you," Antonio said simply, "not for the drama, but for the consistent daily work that repaired a small but significant injury." His tone was private and genuine. "You changed the course of something important." Helena looked up at him, a face that had learned to read silence and make decisions in it. She accepted his thanks with the same modesty she had used in every shift of her life. "I only did what I could," she replied. "I couldn't let her sleep otherwise." "Then allow me to do what I can in return," he said. "If there is anything you need, time, money, education for your niece, anything, ask. I want to make this right in the practical ways that matter."
They both understood that a child's welfare cannot be paid for with money alone, but money can remove burdens and allow a person to be present. Antonio's offer was not a promise to fix everything, but a realistic recalibration, help where it was needed, space to breathe, permission to be seen. Life settled into a softer rhythm than the house had known. People began to notice the ways small kindnesses rearranged priorities. The gardener left a little pile of smooth stones by the nursery door. Rosa learned to tell stories to Leah in the afternoon when Helena was repairing a button. Antonio sometimes arrived with a small, carefully chosen item, a book, a hat, evidence of a man learning to take pleasure in small things rather than only in assets. Time, the slow evidence maker, showed the greatest change. Leah began to wake with a brightness on her face rather than a guarded tightness. Her hands explored with the open curiosity of a child who expects to be met. She would reach for Antonio with a gesture that was at first tentative, then more certain, and he would take the hand with the careful gentleness of someone learning not to break an offering. There were evenings when Antonio read a story and half closed his own eyes. The house's machines hummed in the background, and the world beyond the walls continued its business. He had not become perfect. He still traveled, negotiated, and made hard decisions. But he had reallocated pieces of his life in service of a small human need that mattered above ledger lines. The mattress that had once been a refuge of necessity became in time a symbol rather than a secret. It was moved from the corner and set nearer to the crib when Leah took her afternoon nap if the house needed the extra eyes. Helena still used it sometimes for late-night feedings or for sewing when the light from the window was best. Its patched surface told a story that no one framed at the entrance, that warmth is sometimes improvised, that protection can be a small bed placed in a back room and not a thing to be displayed. On a cool morning half a year after the first discovery, Antonio sat in a low chair by the nursery with a thin book open in his lap. Leah crawled toward him and paused, considering the small man who had been at times distant and now at times present. She reached for his knee and then climbed into his arms as if testing a new geography. He did not pose heroics. He read simply, voice measured, the words forming small constellations in the air. Helena watched from nearby, hands folded, and when their eyes met, there was an unspoken gratitude exchanged, the kind that credits a chosen working order rather than a dramatic absolution. The house had changed in texture. The staff had expectations altered not by a reprimand, but by the steady managerial correction of a master who preferred private order to public spectacle.
There were practical improvements, fair wages, a small fund for educational costs for children of staff, a review board for complaints. But the greatest change was in the atmosphere. People found it easier to put the child's welfare ahead of some misconceived purity of method. Years, as they do, softened edges further. Leah grew into a toddler who no longer needed a mattress for naps and demanded to climb into larger chairs. She had a dozen small rituals, a particular thumb she chewed when amused, a song she liked to hum that Helena had taught her, and a way of falling asleep against Antonio's chest with a confidence the house had not seen before. Antonio had not become a father in the fairy tale sense of constant heroism. He had become a man who knew that sometimes the smallest decisions, choosing a caregiver with steady hands, reading an extra story, rearranging staff, could alter the arc of a child's life. On the anniversary of the day Helena found Leah on the floor, Antonio invited all the staff to a small afternoon tea. He spoke plainly about choices and about responsibility. He did not dramatize the past. He acknowledged the need for vigilance and for humility. A house is its people, he said. The value of a house is not how it looks to others, but how it cares for what is inside. Helena sat near the window with a cup of tea, Leah playing at her feet with a wooden doll. The mattress was stored neatly in a closet, not because it was shameful, but because the house no longer needed an emergency bed in the center of domestic life. It was a quiet reminder folded away, a record of the night when a woman moved without permission and thereby altered a home's direction. When the tea ended and conversations dwindled to soft patches, Antonio approached Helena and pressed into her hand a small envelope. It contained not only money, but an invitation, funds for an evening class she had once mentioned wanting to attend, a scholarship for her niece. Use it however you need, he said, with an attention that made the offer practical rather than sentimental. Helena accepted, voice steady with gratitude and caution. She had done something as simple as hold a child, yet in being seen, she had become part of a larger correction. In the quiet that followed, Leah toddled over and climbed onto Antonio's lap. He looked down at her and then at the woman who had made the mattress into a cradle of trust. "It was just a bed," Helena said, almost laughing, the memory of the cold tile still vivid in her chest. "But sometimes a small bed is where a decision starts." Antonio nodded. "And sometimes small decisions reorder what seems immovable," he said. The story, if it could be called that, ended not in triumphant proclamations, but in the ordinary work of reordering a life. The child's sleep had been protected,
A rigid method had been tempered by gentleness. A household's values had been redirected toward care.
There was no grand transformation, no miraculous revelation that fixed everything forever. There was instead the gradual accumulation of daily attentions, a paid day off, a meeting where a complaint could be voiced and heard, a man learning to be present enough that a child would reach out for him. As the sun slid through the high windows and touched the nursery's white walls, Helena smoothed Leah's blanket, feeling the little body's even breath. The mattress, patched, honest, was tucked away, but not forgotten. It had served as a pivot. It had been a small thing that rearranged a house. If you have a moment, share this story with someone who believes that small acts of care can change everything. What act of quiet kindness altered the course of your life? Comment below.